Good morning or good afternoon, depending on what part of the country and what time zone you're in. And welcome to the webinar on ESOPs as an engine of innovation. I'm Rob Edwards, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. We're very fortunate. This webinar, by the way, is a continuation of a webinar that began in September of this year, which unfortunately we had to terminate early because of technical difficulties. Fortunately, we have addressed the difficulties and we're ready to go today. I'm very lucky to have two highly regarded practitioners with me to deliver the webinar today. Robert Porter Lynch is the founder and chief executive officer of the Warren Company. Robert is a well-known author, business consultant, and a thought leader in the field of collaborative innovation and strategic alliances. His work in joint ventures and strategic alliances goes back for nearly 20 years now. Ken Serwinski is a founder and CEO of Prairie Capital Advisors, a national ESOP valuation and advisory firm. And I can tell you from my experience as a practicing attorney working with Ken's firm, Prairie Capital, they are absolutely a top-notch ESOP valuation firm. So we're lucky to have this panel with us. And what we want to talk about today is innovation and how it's an untapped strategy, largely untapped, that can be used to create a tremendous economic value for employee-owned companies in particular. Some of these ideas I think have been missing in the discussion about employee ownership, but they're really fundamental to the success of employee-owned companies. That's why I asked Robert to make his ideas available to a broader audience. And Robert has really been thinking about this for years and seeking to find a way to put together his work with employee ownership for the betterment of employee-owned companies generally. But before we start, I'd like to ask Ken, in looking at how ESOP companies benefit, Ken, you've worked on the financial side. You've valued ESOPs through Prairie Capital for years. What have you seen and what do you think is missing in terms of the actions that your ESOP clients are taking to increase their economic value?
Well, Rob, I think so much of the work that we do collectively as advisors to ESOP companies is initially focused on the transaction, and a lot of the financial and technical and regulatory issues that we all need to abide by. But one of the things that we sort of get caught up that as the transactions are going on, not a lot is talked about as to how in the long term we might be able to enhance the ESOP through better communication and innovation with the employees. And so my job in coming back and visiting with the number of, we have about 145 ESOP companies that we do annual valuation work for, our folks are charged with the idea of trying to understand how the companies are utilizing their employee ownership culture to be able to enhance value over time. And sometimes without a clear operational or strategic emphasis on what this really means to the employees, sometimes this falls by the wayside. And I think what we're going to talk about today, and Robert will talk about it shortly, is how innovation can enhance value, and then I'll be back a little bit later on to talk about how that translates to valuation.
Right, so Ken, you see a gap between what your client ESOP companies are doing and what they ought to do or what they might consider doing to become more successful or more profitable. Robert, you've worked with small companies, including employee-owned companies, for years. What do you think is what do you think about ESOP companies in particular and their tendency to focus on transactions and technical aspects of the plan, and what are the consequences of that in your opinion?
Well, I'm very opinionated about this, Rob, but the companies that I've worked with that have been employee-owned companies like Procter & Gamble and Damon Worldwide, they really focus on something way, way beyond the mechanics of the transaction. They look at the strategy, and I think that's what we're going to talk about a lot today is how do we create the strategy And how do you use employees? See, employees are so wonderfully positioned to do some remarkable things to create competitive advantage, to create value. So if Ken has some really good value to look at, how do we create it? What's the best way to create value in a company is the key question we're going to be asking here.
Okay, let's turn to the issues that we're going to be addressing today. Broadly, the key areas are how ESOP companies can use collaborative advantage to create collaborative innovation to create a strategic advantage, and a strategic advantage which is borne out in terms of their valuation for the good of all the participants. Specifically, these are the two broad areas, but specifically we look at why collaborative innovation is important, what it is, what are the results that we can expect from it, and how do you get it started. These are the areas that Robert will address, and then we're going to ask Ken to elaborate a little bit on, from his valuation perspective, as to whether it's all worth the effort. Robert, can you get us started?
Sure, and let me just start with a very, very quick background on how employee stock ownership occurred. A fellow named Louis Kelso started it back in 1956, and he was very, very good. He was a lawyer, and he created a whole structure for employee ownership. And it's a structure that has obviously withstood the test of time. It's a great structure, and we've created a whole profession around people who know how to put together deals, how to put together what I might say is the mechanics of getting the tax incentives to work and making sure that companies are happy from a mechanics standpoint. What also happened in the late 40s was a fellow named Joe Scanlon started to engage in how to get workers to be participatory and how to start to solve problems in the steel industry, getting workers to help solve the problems. He did some marvelous work in the late 40s. Unfortunately, he died in January of 1956, several months before Louis Kelso put together the employee manifesto called the Capitalism Manifesto. These two fellows never joined forces. They would have. But what Scanlon did is he created what you might call a collaborative strategy, whereas Kelso worked on collaborative structure. Now, the implications of all this are that some companies, and I know one of the companies that's on the phone right now, Initech out in western Michigan, really picked up on this collaborative strategy very, very well. But what ended up happening was the Japanese took it, and they really capitalized on it. Deming figured this out. He brought it to Japan, and it came back looking like Toyota on Honda. One other company that's really picked up on it recently is Procter & Gamble. But these two forces of collaborative structure and collaborative strategy have not really joined up. And part of my objective today is to be able to see how to put these two things together. So what we really need, when you think about it, if you go to any employee ownership conference, and I was very privileged to give a presentation with Ken this year in April in Portland to the National Council of Employee Ownership, is that you hear lots of people talking about structure. You hear a lot of people talking about the operational functionality that has to go into a business. And we also hear one other thing, and I want to caution on this one. We talk about an employee ownership culture. Unfortunately, culture is a very, very hard thing to get your arms around. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, later in this particular presentation, give a couple of clues on how to get at the culture issue. But the most important thing that was missing, in my opinion, as I listened to speaker after speaker, was that very few people looked at the issue of collaboration as a strategy for economic value. And how do you get the structure, the operations, the culture, and the strategy all in alignment? Because if they're not in alignment, what ends up happening is the company starts to get caught between the boat and the pier. And it doesn't really get a good idea of who it is and what it is. So let's take a look at this next slide. And this is going to give you a little clue as to what's going on in the world and why this is so relevant now versus what would have been the case maybe 15 or 20 years ago. On the chart that you see in front of you, if you look at the vertical axis is a combination of change, speed, and complexity that's going on in the world. And on the horizontal axis is a time scale from 1970 through to the present time. And let me explain this, because this is really fascinating what's happening here. For the last 10 years, I've given this little survey of a blank chart, no graphs on it, nothing, just a blank chart with the vertical axis and the horizontal axis to well over 10,000 business executives throughout North America. And I've asked them to start down at the intersection of the X and Y axis down in 1970 and plot out the level of change, complexity, and speed as it's occurred over the last 40 years. What's amazing, Rob and Ken, I'm sure you've experienced this yourself, is that someplace in the middle 90s, executives tell us the world shifted, the clock speed increased. There's a frenzy level, where all of a sudden things seem to be going so much faster than they ever went before.
Robert, it sounds like that's the beginning of what everyone refers to as 24/7.
Yes, 24/7, and it's generated by things like computers, the internet, cell phones, globalization of the marketplace, information technology, computers on every desk, and all of a sudden we're all going like crazy. There's an old little saying that said, God put me on this earth to do just so many things. Right now I'm so far behind. And so what's really occurred, though, in the business world is someplace in the last 10 to 15 years, most people have experienced a massive change in the way we operate. And organizations that were very hierarchical, as you see back in the 1970s, have now really shifted, and those are still working in the hierarchical kinds of companies where they want to have everything logical and linear, have had to change their strategy or really be competitively disadvantaged. And so now we're in a world where breakthroughs and alliances, collaboration, innovation are really the key issues for making a company competitive. So I'm going to talk about what's really happened here in the world that's come to us. Let me just pick up on this chart, though, and put it in a perspective so that we can really see how the world has changed. If you think of, for example, the world that Louis Kelso existed in back in the 1950s, that was the industrial age. That was where the big argument, if you go back in any of the literature from those days, it talked about labor versus capital. Labor versus capital, and a lot of the labor unions that exist today still frame some of their dialogue in that perspective. The industrial age, though, made us think of ESOPs in a particular way, that what we want to do is we want to democratize capitalism. And there's nothing wrong with that, except what's happened is by about 1980, we went from the industrial age to the information age. And the explosiveness of the curve you saw on the previous slide really shows us that today we're in the age of innovation. And the age of innovation is a very different kind of an age than the industrial age, but in many ways we haven't changed the thinking inside our employee-owner companies to reflect the innovation age, where intellectual capital is the key element in creating competitive advantage.
Robert, what's the difference between the innovation age and the information age?
Well, this came up in an employee-owned company just last week, when they said, what we are is we're going from, we're a data-rich environment right now. Lots of data. We have lots of data transfer, and we talk about information technology people, and a computer on every desk, and I'm linked up to the internet, and I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm on Facebook, and that's lots of information. But innovation essentially uses the creative elements of the brain to think through what can be done outside of the computer. So really the innovation age is linking the computer and information to lots of new ideas. It's imagination, it's creativity. It's the kinds of things that are constantly increasing our ability to look at things in a new way.
So it's a transitional, you're saying it's a transitional period which harnesses the power of the computer to make the transition from the industrial age to the innovation age.
Absolutely. The information age actually was a transition period. Most people thought it was such a great leap that that was the end-all and be-all. It's just a transition between this new age that we're really engaged in now. So what that really does, and if anyone has not read A.G. Lafley's book on the Game Changer, which is how Procter & Gamble over the last decade really went forward to create a whole new set of, a new way the company would think. What you start to realize is that Procter & Gamble as one employee-owned company, and I've worked with Procter & Gamble extensively on this, has used a methodology but it leverages off some thinking. And if you think about this and that curve that you saw a couple slides earlier, that in a fast-moving, rapidly changing world, the innovation that you create is that which is going to be most sustainable. If you think about the industrial age, in the industrial age we looked at competitive advantage coming from things like bigness. General Motors thought that being big was going to make them very, very successful. We thought that having lots of money would make you very successful, and banks had lots of money, and we can easily see how the banks blew that through their economic cannibalism. So it's really, if you think about it, what creates the value, the stuff that Ken loves to go in and his 145 companies and see, okay, what created value. If you look at the ones that create the most amount of value across industry after industry after industry, you'll find that they're the most collaborative and they're the most innovative. And that's where the real advantage is coming from today.
Okay, now we're going to push you a little bit, Robert, because it's easy to say collaborative innovation, and it sounds great, and you're going to be pressed here to explain a little more clearly to the participants just what exactly is it?
Sure. What is collaborative innovation? What is the innovation? On the left-hand side of the chart that you see here is you look at what you hear in most employee cultures, own cultures, is that people talk about how are we going to share the pie, what are the benefits of employee ownership, how do we value the stock, and what's the ownership culture? And that's usually addressed inside the operating statement. And in the operating statement, which becomes the pivot point for so much of the way the company operates, we look at revenues, in other words, sales. We subtract out all the expenses, and what's left are the earnings, and that tells us what the economic value is. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Don't let me say that there's something inherently wrong. I'm simply saying that that's not enough. And if you're thinking only in those terms, you're thinking too small. What we're saying here is that what's on the right-hand side of the page is that how are we going to grow the pie? How are we going to create something of real value? How are we going to make sure that we create something powerful and more? And so, Rob, if you go back to that one, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to look at how do you make big pies, okay? So not just how do we share the pie, how do you make a big pie? And how do you create more top-line revenue? And how do you use your internal resources, your people, to generate more, to be more collaborative, to create more innovation? And also, and this is very important that you understand, collaborative innovation is not just inside the company. It happens with your customer and with your suppliers as well. Because collaborative innovation creates competitive advantage by being cooperative in the entire value chain, not putting a wall around your company, but seeing your suppliers and your customers as part of the flow. And I'm going to make a comment here, and we can come back to this one, but this comment may not register at first, so let it digest for a little bit. That in the world of finance, currency is measured by money. In the world of trust, in the world of relationships, currency is measured by trust. And in the world of collaboration and competitive advantage, the currency is measured through innovation flows. So value is measured by innovation. And those are important themes we're going to
And what you're
pick up on here.
What you're saying is that successful companies that have installed or have followed a collaborative innovation strategy or adopted such a strategy expand their horizons. They go outside the company.
Yes, very much so.
Let's keep going on.
So what we're going to talk about here is when we talk about innovation, this is where I'm going to crack the code. There was a funny story at the Employee Ownership Conference back in April where someone said, somewhat what Potter Stewart said about pornography. He said, well, I can't define pornography, but I know what it looks like when I see it. And they said the same thing goes for innovation. Well, I'm going to start cracking the code on the issue of what innovation is. I want you to think about this. Innovation is simply a strategy, a system, a structure, a product, or a process that generates new sources of value or growth for an organization. Now, we want you to be clear that this does not make technology the sole source of innovation, as we're going to describe on the next slide. So on this one, I'm going to outline to everyone here what it is that really makes up technology, innovation, and differentiate it from all other sources. So this is what we call the innovation engine. And before I describe the innovation engine, I want to make a couple of key points because they really are important for people to understand. First of all, there are 7 different types of innovation, and if you think of only one, you're getting too small. Secondly, 80% of all innovation is non-technical. So all you people who are on the phone who don't have engineering degrees or science degrees, you're in luck. You're not out of the game, you're in the game, and this is what makes it so important.
Then I can breathe a big sigh of relief, Robert.
Yes, you can. You may be technologically inept, but you're still an innovator, Rob. And so are all the other people. Everybody can be an innovator, and this really means that every employee should be thought of as an innovator, not as a worker. And that if you capture the multiple forms of innovation that we have, we're going to be able to really, really generate power for you. So I'm going to walk through this one and just describe it briefly because we'll only have time for a brief description, but I think it will really open up a few eyes. And if we start at the 1 o'clock position on the engine here, technology innovation. So that's going out and creating a new technology, something that really is different from a scientific standpoint. And some companies are very, very good at that. You know, you may find a new computer technology that you're going to use or a new piece of software you're going to create and develop. Usually that's the purview of engineers. But let me give you some other simple examples to show where other forms of technology, or excuse me, innovation really work. For example, at 3 o'clock point, there's system solution. Take a simple thing that General Motors has one division. It's the only profitable division. It's where innovation flows a lot. It's the only division that uses strategic alliances, and it's their OnStar division. And OnStar is simply a system solution to help a driver in an automobile do what they have to do when they're on the road. There's no new technology inside OnStar, but people love it because it really works. Let's go down to the 5 o'clock position, to product innovation. Everybody knows or has an Apple iPod. The iPod technology is 20 years old. There's nothing new in an iPod, but Apple made a great product improvement. It's very, very innovative, and it's one that even grandmothers and grandfathers can use because it's so simple. It's simply a way in which they integrated the interfaces on it so anybody can use it. And Rob, you can use an iPod, can't you? When your kids and your grandchildren have iPods, you can use it too.
I've learned.
Yes. Let's look at another one. A lot of people use Dell computers. There's no new technology in a Dell computer. In fact, they have the lowest R&D percentage cost in their company of any computer company. But why you buy a Dell computer? Because they use process improvements to keep the cost really down. They work with their suppliers in their flow. They got down really lean, like Toyota uses lots of process improvements, and those become very innovative. Now, Dell also was very innovative because they were the first to use a new business model. And the business model was very, very clear. Sell over the Internet. And custom design a computer over the Internet and have it in your hands in several days. That was a business model shift, and it's a powerful one. Now, other companies, for example, do things like market extensions. They sell you something completely new. Amazon, for example, created a whole new customer experience in the market extension, and then they didn't just sell books, they sold everything else under the sun over Amazon. So that became an extension of their customer base. And the last category at the 12 o'clock position there, you see socio-organizational. You know, you see easy things you'll know, like Facebook is an innovation, or LinkedIn is an innovation. But also worker participation is a socio-innovation. Another one, strategic alliances between your suppliers and your customers. That's a socio-organizational innovation. So the point is, try to be good at every type of innovation if you want to be an innovation company and create new value. So where do I find this? And this is what the fun part is, and actually it's the easy part of this. And that is that you can find sources of innovation, what we call innovation triggers any place. You know, for example, if something just costs too much, if you've got warranty problems, total cost of ownership, it's just something's too costly, there's a place to find innovation opportunities. Or if the problem's going on over and over and over again, or divisions inside your own organization are dysfunctional, or you just can't get along with a supplier for some reason. All this is a list of what we use as innovation triggers, and they're really easy ways of just thinking, hey, here's a place to find the innovation. And you can find them any place in organizations and in value chains. You know, some of the work that we've done with a number of companies is to go back out to the suppliers. This is what we did with Procter & Gamble, is go back into the suppliers and ask them what innovations they had. It was amazing when we asked suppliers of Procter & Gamble, do you guys have any innovations sitting on your shelf or that you're working on that we might be able to put into a product? You know, things like Mr. Clean Eraser or the Swiffer show up. You know, it was amazing the thousands of different types of innovations that are sitting out there. All you have to do is ask, and it's astounding what occurs. So let's take a look at the next one here, and that is generating a continuous stream of ideas. Where do you get these? And I want to make a couple of key points on this. I've never found a workforce in my life that didn't already have to, or didn't already have a whole series of creative ideas. You know, we found labor unions that where the workers, you know, were on strike a lot. When we went into those companies, it was astounding what new innovations they had if you asked for them and you nurtured them. Usually, however, they don't show up right on the beginning. People want to know, is management really, really interested in these innovations? So they might give you something a little small. You know, for example, well, the vending machines never work right around here. What are you going to do about that? If management says, well, we were looking for big stuff, they'll overlook what the real opportunity is there.
Robert, does the source of innovation begin at the top, or can it bubble up from the bottom? Is it top down or bottom up, or could it go either way?
It really goes either way. You know, what you do is you just look for where the energy is. I love to look at energy flows. If there's a pocket of people, a team that really wants to be innovative, you know, let it start to flow from there. But in the long run, your question is a fascinating one, because in the long run, most of the innovations come out of the workforce itself. But if it doesn't have support from the top, if the top people aren't really engaged in it, then what happens is it really dies.
So really the structure of an employee-owned company would be uniquely well-suited to collaborative innovation, because the employees are already owners. In many companies, they have a culture which encourages them to think and act like owners.
Exactly. That's exactly the point of this whole webinar, is to make that one point loud and clear.
Okay.
Now, in this next one, unfortunately, the data somehow ended up white on here. It's been whited out.
I think we were technologically challenged, Robert. Perhaps we didn't rise to the occasion.
But let me just tell you what would have gone in there. This actually compares the Japanese and American companies on how many employee ideas we have. And here's what the data shows. In Japanese companies, which were really influenced particularly by Deming, who got the ideas from the U.S. in the first place, the typical Japanese individual has someplace in the vicinity of about 30 to 50 new ideas per employee every year. And they encourage their employees to come up with new ideas. In the American company, that's one idea for every 8 people every year. I mean, it's abominable. In our U.S. culture, we accept, you know, a minority of all of the ideas. And in a Japanese company, the typical adoption rate is between 70 and 80%. Now, Japanese ideas, though, are much smaller. Sometimes the ideas are only, you know, worth like $100 on the average, whereas the U.S. ideas are worth $6,000, $7,000. But the point is, when you take the number of savings per employee every year, the Japanese per 100 employees might save $500,000 for the company in new innovations that are not only saving money, and I want to really make the point, it's not just saving money, but it's also creating new value in the company, coming up with ideas that are better for the customers, that make suppliers flow innovation through them, et cetera. In the U.S. companies, it's just a trickle.
So you're saying this in American businesses, we have to get beyond the suggestion box.
The suggestion boxes don't work. This is an active, participatory, engaged system. If you go to the next slide, I'll just show you Toyota, an example in Toyota. Now, this data from Toyota is not Japanese data. This is American data from the Georgetown, Kentucky plant. This is American workers now engaged in America, building a car here in America in an automobile industry. And if you look at these numbers, they're shocking. Just from in Toyota alone, they get 900,000 ideas just from the American workers. And they adopt someplace between 600,000 and 700,000 new ideas a year. Then if you look at their suppliers who make 65% of, or 80% of the car, 65% of the innovation comes from the suppliers. So if you go and look at your numbers here, Toyota, between its suppliers and its employees, will get someplace in the vicinity of over 2 million ideas adopted. Now the point that I really want to make on this one is down at the bottom. That Toyota beat General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler by becoming an engine of collaborative innovation. It was innovation flow that beat General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. And as a taxpayer, all of us on this phone who are taxpayers are paying the economic penalty for bailing out, at least General Motors and Chrysler, because they did not adopt innovation flow.
So what I'm hearing you say is that beating your supply chain up to deliver the lowest possible price and then cutting it by a fixed percentage every year is not the way to go.
It's not the way to go. I can show in study after study after study. You can go on our website and see the articles and the data from that. Beating up on suppliers is simply ineffective. It doesn't save you money, because what ends up happening is just cheapens your product. And I'll just give you an example. I was trying to convince General Motors of this back about 10 years ago, that beating up their suppliers was not being effective, and I was training a lot of their suppliers, and some of those suppliers are on the phone right now as we're listening to this webinar. And General Motors really gave the clue away when they told me that their warranty costs were higher than their profits. Well, that's because they were beating up on their suppliers. The suppliers are feeding the cheapest thing instead of the best thing, and General Motors is paying it in warranty costs. That's just a simple example. So if you want to see what this really means inside a company, I know this is a busy slide and we can't do the dissolves that this is really designed to do, but think of your company in the center as an engine of innovation. And what you want to do on the left side are inputs, and you have a couple of key inputs. You have your own people are great inputs, and turn your people into an innovation engine. You may also have connectivity with research and development of some sort, and use that as an engine of innovation. And you've also got your suppliers and outsourcing, and use that as an engine of innovation. And then flow out of your company with different solution providers, which can be very, very powerful, and different distributors and your customers. The whole issue of what is the innovation you can provide to your customer, so your customer becomes one of those great sources of innovation and with you. And if you, again, Procter & Gamble has been excellent at this. Damon Worldwide, another employee-owned company, is engaging in this one right now. And I know some of Damon customers are on the phone right now, and they're going to be part of the engine of innovation strategy that we're going to be moving toward. So let me show you just a little bit of how Procter & Gamble, again, an employee-owned company, has done this. You know, what they are focusing on is the key issue of innovation flows, and what A.G. Lafley has done extremely effectively is to create what they call a connect and develop program. They've basically taken research and development and transformed it to a higher level for connect and development. Connect and development. P&G is like in the center of this big circle, and they have a network of sources of innovation that are flowing into the company from all different sources. I should say that the suppliers are probably the largest source on that strategy, but it's highly effective and really beautiful to watch. So let's go to the next one. Now I wanted to give people a little clue here about the issue of a ownership culture. And any time that I use the term ownership culture, here's what ends up happening. Most CEOs, senior executives, when I use the word culture, it becomes a great big soft globule out there, a Gordian knot. Well, what's culture? It's too hard to get my arms around. Well, I'm going to give you a little clue. If you just focus on building a system of trust, It's something that we've spent a lot of time on with our clients, and some of you on the phone have actually seen some of that system of trust. That's the place to start the ownership culture, when people start to trust each other. I'm going to give you a couple of clues. The first thing is the companies who really create a system of trust, they engage in an open conversation about what's in every individual's self-interest and what's in the greater good of the whole. And this has got to be a balance. If you focus too much on self-interest, what happens for people is they all start to maximize for themselves, and you get something absolutely horrible like the economic cannibalism that happened in Wall Street over the last decade, and it took down the entire economic system. Everybody was focusing on self-interest. A good business system focuses on the greater good and the self-interest. It also focuses on one other key element, and that's called honorable purpose. What am I doing? Is this an honorable purpose? And it can be anything from making soap suds. It can be food products. It can be working on automobile parts. It's just an honorable purpose, because one of the things that you can't get around in the human predicament is that people love meaning and purpose in their lives. Now the next slide I'm going to show you on trust is a lot of fun. It's a little busy, but let me take you through it. I'm going to take you from the bottom and work to the top. One of the things that happens in any organization, I have a belt here, and we call that below the belt and above the belt. At the belt line, first of all, is what we call a transaction, and that's mutual self-interest. And a transaction essentially is, it's a neutral trust. Now, anything that happens below the belt, I'll describe some of the below-the-belt activities in a high-trust world, has to be essentially eliminated. If you want a good company on this one, employee-owned company, Southwest Airlines has probably done as good a job as any employee-owned company in the world on getting rid of below-the-belt activity. And I'll just explain it to you. If anybody on the phone has ever been betrayed, and I know there's a lot of you out there, you can remember betrayal. That's the assassination part, the one at the very, very bottom of the scale. If you've been betrayed and that kind of thing goes on inside a corporation, you better get it solved and get rid of the kinds of people who do it. Nullification is just making you into a nothing, just avoiding you, never even talking to you. Corruption is doing unethical stuff, the bribery that puts my self-interest again way above the greater good of the whole. Aggression, people who bluster and make a whole lot of noise, or passive-aggressive people who smile at you and then talk ill things behind your back. People who are deceptive, who don't tell you the truth, who aren't really honest with you. People who are manipulative. People who are constantly being in what we call a protection zone. They're constantly running into their cave, or they need a lawyer to talk to before they ever, can have a conversation with you. Or the one that you see so much in organizations, what we call detraction. It's judgment, evaluation, people saying you're not good enough. That kind of activity, when it goes on in a corporation, will actually destroy trust. The builders of trust are fascinating ones. And the first level up is, can we just have a relationship? As Joan Rivers said, can we just talk? Can we just talk to each other? If you can't just talk to people without being judgmental and critical all the time, there's no way to build trust. But real trust starts to build at the next level. We call this guardianship. And a guardianship is when I'm going to protect you and make you safe and secure, and you're going to make me feel safe and secure. Without a level of security, and sometimes that goes as far as well as into job security, there's no trust. But people, if you just stop there, people are not going to be satisfied. They want more than that. They want a sense of teamwork, companionship. We can really work together in an environment that's a lot of fun. Then the next one up, and this is one where a company like Southwest has really excelled, a sense of fellowship, a sense of belonging. You belong to an organization, because right now companies have become a substitute for the decline of the nuclear family. Now in the best companies we have something that becomes a deep friendship, where there's a loyalty, there's a compassion, there's a predictability that I know you'll always be there for me, even if I do something wrong, but you'll help me work through what I did wrong. great companies, we also have a sense of partnership, shared risks and reward. And I want you to think about partnership also as strategic alliances with your customers, with other business units, with other divisions inside your company, and with your suppliers. That extends all the way out. But the beauty of this is the highest level. When we get into high levels of innovation, we create what people love the most, and what you did when you were a kid. People love to create together, and they love to bond. And the creationship is the bonding and the creativity that is the essence of the human spirit. And we created a new symbol for that one, too. You'll see it's, can we dance together? Can we get in tune with each other? It's a massive, massive shift. Now, as we start to wrap this up, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the economic impact. And Ken, I'd like you to join in at this particular point with me on the economics. Does this pay off? Is innovation worthwhile? And the real numbers on this one are pretty spectacular. The innovative companies, are showing an 8.5 times faster growth than the median. Now, I'm going to throw out basically anything that happened from October of 2008 to today because of the anomalies of the stock market. And I can't trust Wall Street to figure out what real value is anymore, but these are real powerful numbers. Ken, Rob, any thoughts on this?
Well, Robert, I want to turn this over to Ken in a minute, but I do have one quick question, and that is whether, in your opinion, it's easier to create a culture of trust in a smaller company versus a larger company. You mentioned Southwest, but how about smaller companies? My perception has always been that some of the most successful companies I've worked with are on small. They have 100 or 200 employees or fewer.
Well, I think the academic studies on this would prove you right, Rob, that small companies are easier to create trust in than large companies, but don't also assume that large companies can't create trust. And I'm actually writing a book right now on leadership and the architecture of trust. And we've been able to show that large companies can create trust, but it is a little bit harder and they have to focus a little bit more. But you can create this trust. There's a system to it, and that's probably going to be the subject of another webinar that we're going to do sometime in hopefully the near future.
That's early 2010. Let's move to Ken. And Ken, can you begin your presentation and show us where the payoff is?
I'd be happy to, Rob. I think what Robert has just talked about is very important, but we sometimes, from our perspective, we get called upon to sort of translate innovation back to economic value. And certainly innovation has, as Robert just discussed it, is a valuation driver in and of itself. And so if innovation is going to enhance company performance, and I think that last slide that Robert just went through with respect to how companies perform profitably, then of course innovation does become a valuation driver. And it's really interesting about valuations because when you're talking about private companies versus public companies, I oftentimes use the analogy that it's very interesting to me that people will over lunch in the company cafeteria or over a cup of coffee in the morning discuss with much fervor the ups and downs of the stock market and how it affected their 401k. And really, what are they talking about? They're talking about valuation changes. And they're talking about what effect a recession has or maybe what a recovery has. But so few companies really spend the time to effectively talk about their own valuation and how the company is valued and how innovation can also lead to improvements in valuation should become the language that the employee owners use to discuss their own company's performance. Now, it's not just something that's relegated to the top 2 or 3 people in the company. This really should be something that is understood by everyone. Everyone who participates in the ESOP should understand what the valuation is about and what are the components of valuation. Because I think the payoff for the employee owners is that they start learning the math as to what's in it for me. Because I don't care whether you're a 20-something or a 40-something, everyone has a different approach to the ESOP. You know, it's funny how the 20-somethings don't view retirement plans as being real. So maybe we call them long-term compensation plans because the money in it is real. Whereas the 40-something starts realizing that retirement just isn't that far off and starts paying attention more to the math as to how valuation can enhance their retirement plan. So let's talk about some basic concepts in investments.
Can I stop you for just a moment?
Sure, sure.
I just want to interject. We have some questions. I have a question that I've received regarding Robert's presentation. I would encourage any listener with a question to send it in, and we will either address it if it's in the flow. If it's a question for Ken, we'll deal with it immediately. Otherwise, we'll hold it if it's a question for Robert until the end of the presentation. Sorry, Ken.
Not a problem, Rob. Not a problem at all. So, you know, when you're talking to your employee group about investments, and really, if you think about it, when the transaction took place, you had a trustee make an investment decision, and that investment decision was to buy the stock of your company. Well, you know, people may understand investments, but they may not, and so having a discussion about where investments come from and in what form they take is something that's very appropriate. So when you think about investments, most people think about real estate, or they may think about CDs, or some will think about precious metals like gold or silver, and other people will think about investing in stocks and companies, and even stocks and companies like ours, for instance. And so the expectation for an investment, either the expectation is that it's going to earn some income like a CD will, or it will appreciate over time, sort of a buy and hold strategy, or sometimes it's a combination of both. So oftentimes it's good basic information to provide to your employees is just what an investment is. And sometimes companies exist, including your company, because people invested in them, either originally or since the company's been put in place. And so when the trustee purchased the stock of the company, the trust became a stockholder in the company. And as investors, they expect an investment return. There will be income as time passes, there'll be appreciation over time, and hopefully a combination of both. And that comes from earning profits, and as you know, as profits grow, you will see an increase in the stock investment of your company. So if you want to think about valuation in the form of an investment, what we think about when we're doing valuations is trying to understand the economics of the company itself, as well as who it competes against in the marketplace, and then what's going on in the general economy and capital markets. You know, it's kind of funny. We have a number of community banks as clients, and one of the CEOs happens to be in suburban Chicago, where I'm located, and stopped in my office back in January and said, you know, Ken, I don't have any bad subprime mortgages. My bad loans in general are really kept under control. I'm a $600 million bank. What's going to happen to my stock value? And I said, Tom, unfortunately, it's going to go down, because you're a reflection of an industry right now that has been badly beaten up by the markets. And so that needs to be communicated to his people. And so even though they're a top performer in their industry, the rest of their industry is in the tank. And so having that discussion about valuation is making people think like investors. So it's not just thinking about what goes on inside the company, but it's also what goes on outside the company. Some things we can control on the inside. Certainly, it's very difficult to control the outside, because really this is how the market prices stocks, and for the most part, we do want to mimic the marketplace and think like investors. So when you're having your valuation done, you look at these ideas of a market approach to value, which is looking outside the firm, where multiples are extracted from market data, and you're looking at any weaknesses that take place, like are the comparables truly comparable, versus looking inside the company, where your valuation firm is looking at discounted cash flow modeling and based upon projections that have to be determined as to whether or not they're reasonable. But that's really the difference between looking outside, which is the market approach, and looking inside. So if you can start communicating how some of these things happen on the outside and how the valuation firm thinks, then maybe some things may be a little clearer to some of your plan participants. So with valuation multiples, there are really only a few working parts to understanding where multiples come from. And those few working parts are on this slide, and they are the near-term income or cash flow, what is the cost of capital or the discount rate, and also what is your long-term growth rate. So a valuation multiple is a fairly simple fraction. It's next year's earnings, earning power, cash flow, divided by the cost of capital less your growth rate. And so we'll show you what that looks like on the next slide. So for example, you have near-term cash flow of $1, and your cost of capital is 18%, and your long-term growth is 6%. So basically, what we're saying is that in order to understand the multiple for this company, is you look at the cash flow of $1, and you subtract the subtract the long-term growth rate from the cost of capital, you get 12%. You divide that 12% into $1, and you come up with an 8.3 times multiple. Well, that's all great, and you can say, well, that's good. I now know what my multiple is, but what happens if we change some of the inputs? What happens if we are innovative, and what happens if we do some things that either create revenue or reduce expenses? Well, we know that'll be an enhancement to cash flow. But what may also happen is if we can make just a few tiny changes with respect to the cost of capital, if our cash flow becomes stronger and more reliant, then the valuation firm may look at the cost of capital and actually drop this from 18% to 17%. And if we've developed some excellent products or services along the way that will enhance our long-term growth rate from what we had on the previous slide from 6 to 7, all of a sudden we're subtracting 7% from 17 and coming up with 10% and dividing that into $1, and our multiple has just become 10 times. So we had an 8.3 times multiple, but by looking at reducing your cost of capital because it's now a less risky proposition for some of the stabilities to your cash flow, and we look at how we can increase the long-term growth rate because the innovative nature of your employees just provided you with product enhancement or new product development or new service development, we've now increased the value of the multiple by 20%, 20+%. So we've gone from 8.3 to 10 times. And those are real increases to value. So when you're looking at the inside approach now to the income, we just looked at the outside on the market approach. Now we're looking at the income approach on the inside, and we're looking at the time value of money. And so what is worth more? And I think most of your employees would say that $10 today is worth more than $10 in 5 years. Now, if they understand that future profits are worth less to investors the farther out they are, because distant profits are a little less certain to occur, their present value decreases. We don't know for sure whether we're going to be able to make $10 in 5 years, so we handicap that with a present value factor. Which would you rather have, 10 today or 10 in 5 years? So the key valuation question that we ask ourselves is how soon will we receive that $10, how much will it be, and how certain are the expected profits? So that's why when you're talking to your valuation firm about the projections for the first couple of years, they have such a direct impact on the valuation of the company that for that particular year. So when you look at this and sort of, this is a very basic idea of receiving $10 over the next 10 years. Certainly the value at the end of 1 year might be $8.70 and decrease to $2.47 over that 10-year time frame. But if we add up all those amounts from $8.70 all the way down to $2.47, we can understand that over the next 10 years, the present value of that cash stream is $50.23 today. And if we apply a market multiple of 5 times, a valuation multiple, I should say, of 5 times cash flow, all of a sudden, we determine that $50 is 5 times that amount. And so what we want to be sure we make everyone clear on is that valuation multiples may stay the same, but that you can see that it can enhance the dollars by which you're multiplying. And that's the key. And understanding how all this flows in through the innovative process of changing the economic value through innovation, whether it's products or services, or simply adopting numerous ideas, no matter how small they are, can vary a stream of cash flows and can enhance the valuation of the company.
Ken, are any of your companies, the ESOP companies whose stock you value, particularly innovative? And if so, how much of a value premium would you put, in your experience, on their innovative skills?
Well, we have some very innovative companies, some that have been around as long as 200 years and have used the ESOP as a mechanism for ownership transition. It's hard to say that we would put a premium on whether or not they're innovative, because we want to be careful we don't double count. And innovation, as I've just sort of indicated in these slides, occurs by enhancements of revenues or reductions in expenses. And so some of these innovative companies tend to be better performers than companies in their industry. It's kind of funny. I'll really have a very quick story to you. We have one company in particular that outperforms its industry peers to the tune of about 20 to 25%. And not going into how they do it, they're just very innovative in their thought process as to how they go to market. Presents a particular quandary because, like many other companies, they receive inquiries about buying their firm. And when the discussions start talking about profitability of the potential buyer versus our client usually tends to exceed the potential buyer's profitability by anywhere from 10 to 30%. And so, ironically, as you know, if you're going to make an acquisition, that acquisition needs to be accretive to the buying company. Well, if you're that much more profitable and productive than the company that's buying you, it sometimes can't be accretive because you have to pay a big price for it. So here's an ironic situation where this company performs far in excess of its industry peers and almost puts them into a position where they can't be bought, and that's sort of in quotes, because they're so profitable.
Nonetheless, that's a problem that a great many ESOP companies would like to have.
Sure, absolutely.
I want to thank you for attending. I do have one question on union participation. Robert, does the difference in union participation enter into the innovation analysis?
I'm going to say conditionally yes, but not necessarily. And I know that sounds like I'm fudging the answer. Let me try to explain what I mean by that. There are many highly innovative companies that are also unionized. I'll give you an example. Procter & Gamble may not have unions. Southwest does have unions. And they can still be highly innovative. I've worked with union officials for years, and I've found that union people usually have to go over the bridge called a hurdle called trust. And where there is a low level of trust, then the union will not accept the innovation because they think they're being abused. But if it's an employee-owned company, the fact that there's a union there, it's a matter now of engaging the union, getting them to see that this is going to be money in their pocket, that everybody benefits, it's for the greater good of the whole, and finding experiments. And what you do in an experiment, you go out and find some people who say, hey, let's try this out, let's see what happens. And if the experiment is successful, can we expand it? I've done it with the steel workers, I've done it in the mining industry, I've done it in a number of industries where you just have to get people to start to talk about it and know that top management is there not to exploit people, but to create better trust, better security, and this is in the greater good of the whole.
Well, thank you, Robert, and thank you all for participating. Robert Lynch, the CEO and founder of the Warren Company, and Ken Serwinski, the CFO of Prairie Capital Advisors. I'm Rob Edwards, partner with Steiker, Fischer, Edwards, and Greenapple. The audio recording of this will be available within an hour or two on the SES Advisors website. That's www.sesadvisors.com. If any of you are interested in obtaining a PDF of the slides, please send me an email, and we will follow up. And honor that request. Again, we thank you for attending.
And thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye
now.
PremiumBeat.com